Welcome back here with Dr. Goldberg. Today we're going to be discussing Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a very famous comic book character. Now it's interesting how the opinions diverge strongly. Liberals believe he's a god, he can save the world. I think he's the avatar of the Being Liberal Facebook page. And then of course conservatives will say stuff to the tune of, well, it's a shame that FDR introduced socialism with the New Deal, but at least he fought Hitler. Oh, I see. Fighting Hitler makes you a good person. Kind of like Stalin. At any rate, let us discuss with our liberal friends, or rather our progressive acquaintances, what FDR actually did. So this is an article by Georgi Takei, and it's concerning, of course, the internment of Japanese Americans, which many people know about, but they don't understand the extent. It happened in Latin America too. Many were rounded up and sent to camps, deported. And not just that, but they also had their possessions and property seized without compensation. That's what happens when the state wants what you own. It reminds me of sort of the negotiations with the Cherokee Nation. They kind of went along because they thought they had a piece of paper, as though that mattered. But if you have no strength, if you're not formidable, unfortunately you get steamrolled. And although in both cases, I don't know if they had the numerical ability to really resist. So it's a bit of a shame, to be honest. There's also evidence that FDR's dislike for Care Bears was one of the reasons why many of them couldn't escape Europe as refugees. And we have the book, The Jews Should Keep Quiet. You can check that out if you would like. Allegedly, he said to Churchill, furthermore, these places are inhabited by some 8 million dark-skinned gentlemen. I don't want them coming to this country and adding to the problem we already have with our 13 million black men. Sounds like an AOC quote, but I'm not sure. Now we get into the economic policy, and I'm not a 100% Ayn Rand pro-market person, but I know a lot of progressives, they don't really have any interest in economics. They like hearing about big names, legislation, even if the legislation does nothing good. So you could argue Work Progress Administration, building sidewalks to nowhere. At least these guys have jobs because there's nothing else for them. Okay, I can sort of understand that. But at any rate, taxes went up from 1.6 billion to 5.3 billion over 7 years, 33 to 40. You have excise, personal income, inheritance, corporate, holding company taxes, and excess profits taxes. Taxes or excise taxes on everything you can imagine: cigarettes, candy, chewing gum, telephone calls, electricity, and radios. And then we have some of the New Deal programs itself. Now, Herbert Hoover and FDR were both adamant that you cannot cut wages. You have to raise wages, often by government fiat. And that sounds good. It's a very good political talking point, but of course it cost a lot of jobs, like 500,000 jobs. National Recovery Act. They say the Labor Relations Act was destructive. I'm not entirely certain about that. Now, if they were bidding for above market wages in a bad economy, that might be true. But this is the Cato Institute. I just want to be clear, and I don't trust them on everything, to be, at least not when it comes to questions of workers' rights. But some of the facts are there, and it's interesting because if you compare the response of the United States to that of fascist Italy, Italy was a poorer country, more agricultural. Mussolini did cut wages, but he also forced rents and prices down. And overall, Italy did much better in the Great Depression than the United States, despite being, again, not very rich, not as developed. So it's an interesting dynamic. They also mentioned that the dam set up by the Tennessee Valley Authority flooded 750,000 acres and dispossessed a bunch of people. Kind of similar to the Three Gorges Dam, what that did to the river valley. Immensely destructive environmentally and also to the various communities in that area. We also have the agricultural policies like the Ag Adjustment Act. Basically, they said we have too much production and the farmers can't sell it for good enough prices. So the government went around buying up 6 million hogs and cattle, and then while people are starving, had them all slaughtered and thrown into mass graves. They did stuff to the tune of tossing, or rather soaking oranges in kerosene so they wouldn't be consumed while people are starving. They cut off the supply of corn and tried to just use it more for fuel, and we ended up having to import corn. So again, while the people are starving, the government is trying to solve the problem and making it worse. And something similar happened under Chavez in Venezuela, from what I've read. There's more information on all the culling of animals. He also signed the National Firearms Act, which was a massive expansion of federal power in the regulation and tracking of firearms. Then you have Executive Order 6102, which was directed to the forbidding of the hoarding of gold coin, gold bullion, and gold certificates within the continental United States. FDR's argument was that we have this recession, you can't be hoarding that stuff, you fat cats. And so you're supposed to turn it in. And I can imagine that progressives probably did so willingly, kind of like they wear masks. I think progressives, if Fauci, the entertainer, were to tell them, you have to, you're a progressive male, you have to be castrated to protect yourself from coronavirus, they would do so without question because the government told them to. Meanwhile, they're out in the streets rioting against the government establishment. Well, this is something the Nazis did similar in terms of either eliminating consumer goods to where you couldn't really spend your money, and then you would put it in the savings account or the bonds, and the government would have your money to play around with the foreign exchange service. It is very un-American as a concept, but it's not surprising it would come from FDR, who is a bit of a communist, if we're honest. You can check out this book if you're interested. It's got some good information on the New Deal. And this is Secretary of the Treasury. We've tried spending money. We're spending more than we ever have spent before. It does not work. I want to see people get enough to eat. We have never made good on our promises. I say after 8 years of this administration, we have just as much unemployment as when we started and an enormous debt to boot. Yep, hard to argue with that. Other stuff that FDR did, well, when his New Deal legislation was struck down, he tried to hack the Supreme Court. He tried to pass legislation to basically kneecap their powers because he didn't like them. He actually said he preferred an unwritten constitution, and that's no surprise. He had people like Ezra Pound thrown into a mental asylum without trial, and this happened to a lot of people, which was, in his defense, it was just an inheritance from Woodrow Wilson. Under his administration, I think it was like maybe, I don't know if it was 10,000 agents or it was 10,000 people arrested without trial because they opposed the war. So Woodrow Wilson started the police state. In fact, his Committee on Information was the basis for Goebbels and the propaganda ministry, just so if you're interested. He also associated with a certain Earl Browder, who was a general secretary and chairman of the U.S. Communist Party. He ended up being sentenced to prison for a passport issue, and FDR pardoned him. There's also some tenuous evidence that FDR tried to join the League of American Writers, which was just a communist front group in 1939. I can't confirm that, but given everyone who was around FDR, it's not beyond the realm of possibility. Some people were Hopkins. He was confirmed to be a communist spy. Alger Hiss, Henry Wallace, his vice president, who was communist in all but name. And, of course, Browder, Browder told him, don't join because it's going to be politically inadvisable and it's going to cause controversy. So, evidence of his soft spot, or hard spot if you wish, for communism. He betrayed people at Yalta. I mean, even Churchill didn't go that far, and Churchill was a good character. I'll have to do some content on him. Basically forcibly repatriated a bunch of folks to the Soviet Union, including anti-communists, and they ended up many of them being killed. His policy when it came to Italy was pretty atrocious, and certainly, what he put in place and what was inherited, because he basically encouraged the communists to come back. And then the Allies, as Italy fell, they basically said, even though fascism was a dictatorship and we oppose that, we're now going to decide what your government's going to be. we're going to rig your elections, we're going to ban certain people from voting, and just allow a lot of folks to be shot because they might have been a member of the fascist party, even if they were just like a clerk in the civil service. You could still be killed, you had no rights. So it's a really bizarre system, to be honest with you. And this is a book, Victims of Yalta, if you're interested. We also have to acknowledge the fact that FDR, with his testimony on the Greer incident, he wanted us to be at war with Germany in 1940, 1941, earlier on. Not just that, the evidence is, and if you think that I'm just making this up, I'll give you some reading material. Admiral Kimmel's own story, Backdoor to War, The Final Secret of Pearl Harbor, and there are many others detailing the fact that he knew the attack was coming and he didn't do anything because he wanted us in the war. Now imagine a president who knows an attack is coming that could kill thousands of people and does nothing because he wants to get us into a long-running, expensive, destructive war that will not only destabilize the international order but also lead to the rise of a very corrupt left-wing communist dictatorship. That sounds kind of familiar. Stop being a conspiracy theorist. That's not true. So, with all that being said, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is the type of person that it's a shame how these folks are lauded because the press, because the propaganda says so. And even though there's information out there, it's like no one actually cares. It's too much work. They don't want to actually go through and kind of knead with it and wrestle and find out the truth. So whether you're a liberal or conservative, you have to know who you're endorsing, who you're gushing over. I mean, hopefully you are. I'm not a big fan of that whole with the lights out. You need to know exactly who you happen to be tussling with. But at any rate, give me your thoughts on FDR. Are you the biggest fanboy, or do you think he was atrocious?